Thanks very much, Robin, and thank you for that kind introduction. And thanks to the Congress organisers for inviting me to speak today. This is what I'm going to try and cover: a bit about the NDIS in Queensland, a bit about our division and the way we're interacting with the NDIS, our experiences and learnings so far, and some take-home messages. I won't spend a lot of time on the NDIS in general. I think we've heard a lot about it. Needless to say, there are 450,000 participants by the end of the rollout, which will be around 2020. I will just spend a minute letting you know what's happening in Queensland. The NDIS commenced in Queensland in July last year and will roll out over the next 4 years. It started in Townsville and Mackay in North Queensland and will then roll out to other regional areas, finishing in Brisbane and the southeast corner in 2019-2020. In Queensland, it's useful to know that there were no trial sites. And as Philippa alluded to earlier, the commencement of the NDIS in Queensland comes on a background of historically, let's say, lower investment in disability services in Queensland, which goes back quite a long time. So while our services are located in Brisbane, or our offices are in Brisbane, because we have statewide services, we're getting participants from all of the areas in Queensland that have started to roll out. Don't worry too much about the detail there. The Division of Rehabilitation consists of specialist and statewide services for people with acquired brain injury, amputation, spinal cord injury and persistent pain. But in my comments today, I'm really going to be concentrating on our brain injury and spinal cord injury services, because that's where we've seen most NDIS participants so far. Over the years, we've developed a continuum of care in spinal cord injury and brain injury that covers inpatient rehab units, outpatients and day rehabilitation, transitional early discharge type services, as well as community outreach services. So in many cases, we provide services for people across their whole lifespan, either intermittently or continuously. Just a bit of context. I think we need to realise that there was a large expectation and hope, I think, around the introduction of the NDIS, that it would improve services for people with, and outcomes for people with disability, and Queensland is no different. The other context for us, which is worth mentioning, is that at the same time as the NDIS was introduced, the NIIS was also introduced. So this is, John Walsh mentioned it in the previous presentation. The Productivity Commission recommended that each state have a national injury insurance scheme that sits alongside the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And these schemes provide a no-fault scheme to fully fund care and support for people with catastrophic injury. So for those states that didn't already have such a scheme. The problem for us is that the NIIS has completely different processes, guidelines, policies than the NDIS. So in fact, we're implementing two new schemes at the same time. This just gives you an idea of our numbers, and our experience with the NDIS is still relatively small. The spinal injuries unit, if I can get a pointer. Oh. So the spinal injuries unit is the inpatient unit, and the BIRU is the brain injury inpatient unit. So you can see that we've got more participants in the spinal injuries unit so far. By far, our biggest numbers are in the SPOT team, Spinal Outreach Team, which is our community outreach team, which provides services to people all over Queensland throughout their lifetime. So For the remainder of the presentation, I want to concentrate predominantly on what's happening in our inpatient units, not because that's the only place that we're seeing problems, but it's probably the place where things are most acutely being felt at the moment. This slide tries to illustrate our rehabilitation program. So from, sorry, I'll get there eventually with this. So admission, commencement of rehabilitation, stabilising health, all the aspects of the rehabilitation program, but really what I want to concentrate on is equipment, planning for accommodation where the person's going to live, and personal care. All of those things have to be in place to allow us to discharge the person back into the community at a level where there's going to be successful community reintegration and a good quality of life. So while this illustrates this as a nice, clean sequence, I'm sure you can understand that it's nothing like that, really. All of these things have to occur simultaneously, interdependently, concurrently, all coming together at the right time within a reasonable time frame. So what I'm going to try and do now is illustrate how the health and NDIS interact, or where they interact. So the yellow arrows are health and the green arrows are NDIS. And in this early stage, in this first slide, most of these things we can understand clearly are health responsibilities. But very early on in this process, we need to start to think about the NDIS. So is the person actually eligible? Making an access request, preparing for planning, and all the time in the middle here where there's almost constant communication back and forth with the NDIS trying to sort things out, especially in these early days. As we move closer to discharge, obviously pulling all of these things together becomes even more important. So planning meetings, implementing the plan, talking, discussing, advocating, checking, clarifying, and then implementing the plan so that we can have the accommodation and the equipment and the personal care arranged on time for discharge. After I'd spent a lot of time putting those previous 5 slides together, one of the project officers who's helping us said to me, I could have saved a lot of time by just doing this, which is, if this is our rehabilitation program and this is the NDIS, putting them together is unlikely to go without some teething problems. So what did we do? Just very briefly, we were lucky enough to get some funding to have some project officers working specifically on this, and to be honest, without that I don't know quite what we would have done, especially as we had the NIIS stuff going on at the same time. So we put together a steering committee, project officers. Some of the things that we did was sort of do a mapping exercise of the clinical and service issues with staff to try and identify where are the interconnecting points between the NDIS and the rehab program. And also we've got the project officers working directly with the clinical teams and with the NDIS participants. So they're actually working on a daily basis and getting an understanding of the clinical issues as well as sort of running the project. We did the usual kind of things that you would do in this case. We have tried to provide staff with information, education, training, engaging staff in the process. We've got a central education resource point, and we've put together websites, and we're trying to put together resources and processes for people to be able to access information easily. And we're trying to develop an understanding of shared pathways between the NDIS and our rehab setting and the clinical practice that goes on there. So, what have we learnt so far? Look, we have to admit that it's fairly early days for us, and we still have fairly limited experience. We certainly have a better understanding of the NDIS, and we're remaining optimistic, and we're committed to working cooperatively with the NDIS to make sure that the outcomes for the people with disability that we look after are as good as they possibly can be. There's no doubt that the NDIS is still in a developmental phase. Processes and policies are being made on the run, changing. It's complex. It does seem quite bureaucratic, and particularly we're concerned that as each new area rolls out, we'll have to start again with new planners, with new coordinators, educating and consulting. I could be wrong, but my impression is that the NDIS processes haven't given a lot of consideration to inpatient rehabilitation settings and how processes might need to be different in those kind of settings. People with newly acquired disability in inpatient rehab units and their families and carers have different requirements to people who are already living with their disability in the community. As well, spinal cord injury and acquired brain injury rehabilitation is pretty specialised and complex in a lot of ways, and the planners haven't necessarily always had a good understanding about the context or the complexity, and you know that's to be expected, and we would expect that that will improve with time. But we do have some concerns regarding the providers and the skill level that they will bring when there are more in the marketplace. There is a significant impact on existing rehabilitation processes and discharge planning. If you expect to be able to do things the way you've done them before, I think it's unlikely that that's going to be the case. Significant planning and attention is required to maintain the best possible outcomes for people with disability, as well as avoiding delays in discharge and rehabilitation. So, take-home messages. The NDIS is here, it's good, and it will be even better in the future. But there are significant impacts on existing rehabilitation programs and other health services, and on processes, and on the people with disability that you look after. I think the health and disability sectors must work much better together to ensure the best outcomes for people with disability. There needs to be, frankly, more genuine consultation and cooperation and less fence building from both perspectives. The knowledge, experience and commitment to working with people with disability in both sectors needs to be acknowledged and valued. And there's vast experience, knowledge and goodwill in the health and rehabilitation sectors regarding people with disability. I believe that in fact we should be talking about interconnections rather than interfaces, and you can see the differences in the definitions of those two words, which I think are important. Rehabilitation services and other health services are often the interconnections between health and disability sectors and services. We need processes and procedures to be developed that encourage and promote cooperation between the services, and rehabilitation physicians and services and teams and other physicians often can and should facilitate this cooperation. And finally, people with newly acquired disability do require different considerations. People with established disability know their disability and are experienced with living with it. People with newly acquired disability are often struggling with the day-to-day barest understanding of what's happened to them, let alone knowing what things are going to be like in 6 months, 2 years or 5 years. And even core tenets like choice and control have very different meanings if the only home that you've ever known for the last 6 months is a hospital and a rehabilitation unit. So how do we understand choice and control in that context? Okay, and some final thoughts, and I'd love to say these are mine, but they're not. Helen Dickinson from the Public Service Research Group wrote this online in The Conversation fairly recently, and it's a bit wordy, but I want to read it because I think it sums up well probably where we're at. We're less than a year on from the rollout of the NDIS nationally. Given the size and scale of the reform agenda, we can't expect to see change emerge overnight. Some of the current commentary around the scheme goes too far in making definitive statements about success or failure. We should expect some challenges to arise as the NDIS is implemented, and this doesn't mean that the idea is fundamentally flawed. But having patience doesn't mean ignoring these problems either. The government needs to ensure that appropriate mechanisms are put in place to learn from the issues as they arise. The scheme is certainly in need of refinement, but we must not abandon it altogether, given that the life prospects for those with disability are significantly worse than for the general population and well below those of comparable nations.